You're good to go.
Good to go?
Yep.
Okay, so today I'm going to continue on with part two of the teachings about covenants. So we're going to review a little bit about what we learned the last time. Then we're going to spend a bit of time on trying to understand the difference between a promise and a covenant. And we'll lay the foundation for getting into the Abrahamic covenant. We'll go over many of the promises and stuff that were made to Abraham. And I think I'm going to stop right before we start into the Abrahamic covenant, the covenant itself, because it'll probably be 30 minutes or so of stuff. And then we'll pick up next week or the week after or something on the actual Abrahamic covenant. The covenant of Abraham is very important. It really affects your understanding of the whole Bible. And it's a message about God's redemptive grace and his determination to bless mankind when he makes this covenant with Abraham. And how you understand the covenant affects your theological perspective on the importance of Jesus Christ as well as the future kingdom and all that. After Abraham closes out his life, the rest of the Old Testament refers back to the Abrahamic covenant. Even the Mosaic covenant is founded on the Abrahamic covenant. And then the New Testament also refers back to the Abrahamic covenant as it's developing the new covenant, and Christ comes. And then Christ makes it possible for the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant in the future. And so we'll just go over a little bit about the overview of Genesis. And Abraham is first mentioned in Genesis chapter 11. And for the duration of the teaching, I'm going to refer to him as Abram. And I'm going to do that because he's called Abram from chapter 11 up to chapter 17. So when the sign of the covenant is given, which is circumcision, God changes his name to Abraham and changes Sarai's name to Sarah. And we'll get into a little bit about what that means. Abraham, the word Abram means exalted father. And when the name is changed to Abraham, it's the father of many nations. That change in the way the Hebrew goes as the father of a multitude or father of many nations. And Sarai, the word means princess. And then when her name is changed to Sarah, it means mother of nations. So, but for the beginning, we'll just stick with Abram until we get to that part. And pardon me if I make a mistake and say Abraham. So Abram's first mentioned in Genesis chapter 11. That's his genealogy. And after that, then it goes in chapter 12, is when God first makes a speech to Abraham, asks him to leave the area of Ur and go to Canaan. In chapter 13, we learn about the wealth of Abraham and when Abraham and Lot separate, as well as additional promises. In chapter 14 is where Abraham rescues Lot, and we have Melchizedek show up. In chapter 15, this is where there's the covenant is first mentioned, and there's additional promises at that time. And we see the blood covenant ritual, which we covered the last time. And then chapter 16 is where Hagar and Ishmael show up, and Ishmael is born when Sarah is frustrated because she's not becoming pregnant. And then in chapter 17 is where we get the sign of the covenant, and we learn about circumcision. Abram is 99 at that time, and that's where the names are changed. In chapter 18 is where we have the three visitors, and God makes additional promises to Abraham, and that's where it goes on to the story of Sodom and Gomorrah and the story of Lot, and the rescue of Lot. Then in chapter 21 is where Isaac is born. And chapter 22 is where the sacrifice of Isaac And then God confirms for the final time his covenant with Abraham. And that's the last time that God speaks to Abraham. So in reviewing covenants, we talked about that the last time, is that there are 6 covenants between God and man. The Noahic covenant, which we learned about last time, we went into that in detail. The Abrahamic covenant, which we're going to build up to today. The Mosaic covenant, the priestly covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant. And over time, we'll get into all those sooner or later. There are 2 broad categories of covenants. From theologians, the way that they try to look at covenants in that time period. One was called a grant covenant, and all the covenants except the Mosaic covenant is a grant covenant. Grant covenants is where the giver makes an obligation to the vassal or to the receiver. The treaty covenant is where the giver or the king, for instance, imposes an obligation to the vassal. So all the covenants except for the Mosaic covenant, God is granting things to the believers. And the things that make a covenant have to do with the phraseology. So primarily God says, I'm establishing a covenant. So it's easy to know, here's a covenant. But they also use the term cutting a covenant, and that referred to the ritual of cutting an animal in half and walking between the halves. There are pledges in a covenant sometimes, such as a solemn promise or a pledge of fidelity or giving a gift. We learned that Jonathan and David made a covenant, and Jonathan gave his sword and his armor and all this stuff to David to confirm the covenant. You can think of making an oath as part of a pledge in a covenant. The ratification ceremony is part of that, walking between the animals or shaking hands in today's world, signing a document. Those are things that you do to ratify an agreement. And then lastly, one of the things that makes a covenant official is a sign. And we learned in the Noahic covenant that the sign, when God promised to never destroy the earth again by flooding, he put a sign in the heavens, the rainbow, to remind him and to remind everybody that he had made that covenant. So let's get on with some of the specifics of why we have to understand promises and covenants. And I'm going to be using the REV Bible for my reference Bible today. And so turn to Galatians chapter 3. I'm just going to read a couple passages of scripture that shows in the New Testament how the terminology of promises and covenants is all through the New Testament. And many times, I know by just speaking for myself, I really didn't place any heavy meaning on that. I just really didn't understand what that was. And I hope that developing through the chapters in Genesis that concern promises and covenants, that we'll understand that better. So in Galatians chapter 3, I'm going to start in verse 15. Okay? So Paul writes, "Brothers and sisters, I am speaking in human terms. Even a covenant that has been ratified by man, no one annuls or adds to it. Now the promises that were spoken to Abraham and to his seed, it does not say, and to seeds, as referring to many, but referring to one, and to your seed, which is Christ. Now I tell you this, the law, which came 430 years later, does not invalidate a covenant previously ratified by God, so as to nullify the promise." So in understanding that passage, it's important to understand the differences between covenant and promise, and we're going to get into all those differences and understand as time goes by the Mosaic covenant that's referred to here, as well as the Abraham promises and all that. So let's turn to Acts chapter 7, and we'll give you another example. In Acts chapter 7, verse 1, this is Stephen's speech to the Sanhedrin when they grab him and ultimately stone him. And it's chapter or verse 1. It says, "And the high priest said, 'Are these things so?' And he said, 'Men and brothers and fathers, listen.'" That's Stephen. "The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran, and said to him, 'Get out of your land and away from your relatives and come into the land that I will show you.' Then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and lived in Haran. And when his father was dead, God removed him from there into this land in which you now live. But he gave him no inheritance in it." Now, inheritance is, a lot of times when we see this word inherit or inheritance, it usually has a connotation of land. Occasionally it means other things, but usually we're talking about land whenever you see that word. So he gave him no inheritance in it, no, not so much as to set his foot on it, but he promised that he would give it to him as a possession and to his seed after him, even though he had no child. And God spoke this way, that his seed should be foreigners in the strange land, and that they would enslave them and mistreat them 400 years. "And I will judge the nation in which they will serve as slaves," said God. "And after that they will come out and serve me in this place." And he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham fathered Isaac and circumcised him the 8th day, and Isaac fathered Jacob, and Jacob fathered the 12 patriarchs. So again, kind of gives you an example of how frequent and how common the term promise and covenants shows up. And so as we build our knowledge of that, it'll help us understand better. So let's go back to Genesis. And I'll just remind everybody that, so in chapter 9 is where we had the Noahic covenant, the flood, the ark, that people are coming out of the ark, and Noah's family is out, reestablishing civilization. In chapter 10, we have what's called the Table of Nations. And Table of Nations is the descendants of Noah, and it goes through all of his sons and their descendants on down. And then in chapter 11, is the story about the Tower of Babel, and where the languages are confused and the people are scattered over all the earth. And then chapter 11 is considered the pivotal chapter between all that happened after Noah and then the transition into Abraham and his descendants. And so if you look in chapter 11, you can just go to chapter 11 there. I'm not going to read through that, of course, but there's 10 generations from Shem down to Abram. And then we'll start reading in verse 26. And it says, Terah, that's Abraham's father, lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So there's 3 brothers, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now this is the history in verse 27. Now this is the history of the descendants of Terah. Terah became the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Haran became the father of Lot. Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldees. Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife, was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, who was also the father of Iscah. Sarai was barren, she had no child. Now I'll mention here that who Sarai was is a little confusing. So last week, or a few weeks ago, when we were talking about the covenants that were made between different people and what covenants were, remember the story about Abraham moving into the Philistine area in Canaan, and Abimelech was the king, and Abram told Abimelech that Sarah was his sister. And then Abimelech said, fine, she can move in with me. And then ultimately, it was, curses came on Abimelech, and he found out that the Sarai was actually Abram's wife. And then Abram and Abimelech created covenants and so forth. So trying to sort out whether Sarai was actually Abram's sister is confusing, and when I look at different sources, I get different answers. So in this verse, there's one of the sources, well, and the part of that is because the Hebrew word for sister is the same word as cousin. So that's part of the confusion. And then one of the sources thought that that this Iscah, the daughter of Haran had two daughters. Haran was Abraham's brother. Haran had two daughters, Milcah and Iscah. And one of the sources said that, well, Iscah is another name for Sarai. So that's a possibility. I'm not saying what is, I'm just saying that that was raised as a possibility. And so in that case, Iscah is a cousin of Abram's. And Haran died, so his two daughters were without a father. And so Nahor married one of them, and then the assumption would be, well, maybe Abram married the other one. But anyway, let's move on to verse 31. Terah took Abraham, his son, Lot, the son of Haran. So Haran had three kids, two daughters and one son. His son's son, so that's Lot, describing Lot. So Lot was the grandson of Terah, his son's son. And Sarai, his daughter-in-law. Now, see, when Moses was writing this, it would have been very nice for him to clarify this right here in this verse right now. But anyway, he just says that Sarai is his daughter-in-law. He could have said it's my daughter and wife of Abram, but he didn't. He calls her his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. They went from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. They came to Haran and lived there. The days of Terah were 205 years. Terah died in Haran. So I did have this nice map to show you, but it's on my other computer, and I forgot to bring it over to my laptop. So I'm going to show it to you next time to give you an idea of where Ur was. Ur is in present-day Iraq, and it's over on the Persian Gulf. It's an ancient city, way back from the time of Abram, which was 2000 BC, and its ruins are present today. And it's not on the coast anymore because of erosion and different changes in the coastline and stuff, but Ur was a prominent city in Mesopotamia at the time that Abram was starting off. And so that was their home place for Terah and Abram. And it's believed that, and this is part of the commentary from Schoenheit, was that Abram received the revelation that we're going to learn about to come out of Ur and go to Canaan while he was at Ur. His father was still alive, but the assumption was that Terah was infirm. He was ill. He only had a few years left to live. And it was the revelation from God to Abram which prompted the move and the journey to begin to go to Canaan. But they only got as far as Haran. And part of the assumption is that it was because of his father being ill. And so anyway, the whole tribe was on their way from Ur to Haran. And Haran is more north and west in Mesopotamia and much closer to Canaan. And Haran is the same, it's the city, and it's the same name as Abram's brother. And it's assumed that was Abram's brother was named after him. Whether it was named after him after all these people died or before, because one of the problems that we have in reading this section is that it was written hundreds of years later after these events happened. So it was written by Moses hundreds of years later. So people at the time of Moses knew about the Chaldeans, knew about Haran, and so those things could have actually been established at the same time or after Abram came through. And it talks about they went from Ur of the Chaldees. So the Chaldees were a tribe of militant people. And the Chaldees really didn't exist at the time that Abram was passing through, or the very primitive tribes that ultimately became the Chaldees. The Chaldees existed more by the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was a Chaldean, and Chaldeans are mentioned at various places in the Old Testament as being raiders and vicious and those kind of things. But so the people that were reading this from the time Moses wrote it down all knew who the Chaldeans were and where they came from. So they came from Mesopotamia and Babylon, and those are the tribes and stuff that culture developed from. And so, but at the time that Abram lived, the Chaldeans were just very, very primitive beginning tribes. Make sense?
No.
So let's go down further, and we'll try to understand a little bit more the differences between promises and covenants. Promises and covenants are similar, but they're not synonymous. A promise is a declaration of the Lord's intention to do something for Abraham. And a covenant is the Lord's binding obligation confirmed by those things that I mentioned about what a covenant was, like the right phraseology, the practice of including an oath or a sacrifice or a blood sacrifice, where God binds himself to Abraham and his seed. He obligates himself with a covenant. Now there's an old joke that people used to tell when they're trying to teach their people about commitment, and it's the joke of the chicken and the pig going to breakfast. Anybody ever heard that before? So the chicken and the pig were getting together and they were going to have breakfast. And so they sat down to talk about what they were going to have for breakfast. And so they finally decided that they were going to have ham and eggs. And so they went to breakfast. Well, so that's an example where you say that the chicken was involved, but the pig was committed. So I liken. So if you think of a promise is the chicken made a promise and the pig made a covenant. Okay, so the covenant is a bigger total commitment that you're gonna mean what you say. All right. So so there's a close connection there, of course, between promises and covenants. But the promise really is the basis for the covenant. So let me have you turn to Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2. So this is going to kind of clarify that a little bit more about the covenants are based on promises. So in verse 11, it says, "Therefore, remember that at one time you, the Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by those who are called circumcision, which is done in the flesh by human hands, that at that time you were without Christ, excluded from the citizenship of Israel, and strangers to the covenants based on the promise." So covenants based on the promise. So that kind of is the explanatory verse that helps to understand this point I'm trying to make. Having no hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who were at one time far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. So as you can see there that the covenants and promises are similar, but they're not exactly the same. Let me have you go now to Hebrews chapter 6. So when it comes to a promise and a covenant, you have to remember that both are guaranteed by God, because God cannot lie. So when he makes a promise, it's guaranteed. And he cannot die. So when he promises to die in the blood covenant, in a blood covenant, when you walk between the pieces, you're saying that if I violate this covenant, may it be done unto me what we did to these animals. So God cannot lie, cannot die. So the covenants these are reassurance that God means what he says. So in Hebrews chapter 6, there'll be some more explanation of this. So in verse 10, for God is not so unrighteous as to forget your work and the love that you showed toward his name by having ministered to the holy ones, and in your continuing to minister. And we desire that each one of you show the same diligence to have the full assurance of the hope until the end, so that you will not become sluggish, but you will be imitators of those who through trust and patience inherit the promises. For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater to swear by, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you greatly, and I will multiply you abundantly. And thus, having patiently endured, he obtained the promise, talking about Abraham. For people swear by that which is greater than themselves, and for them an oath given for confirmation is an end to every dispute. So an oath, just as a reminder about oaths, an oath is something like, when you go to court, you say, I swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God. That's an oath. So or if you say, if I'm not telling the truth, may God strike me dead. That's an oath. So when you bring God into it and you swear that you're going to, that's taking an oath. So let me read the same thing again here. So people swear by that which is greater than themselves. So you swear to God, that's greater than yourselves. And for them, an oath given for confirmation, like you're going to tell the truth, is an end to every dispute. In the same way, God, intending to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose, guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things, in each of which is impossible for God to lie, we have strong encouragement, we who have found refuge in laying hold of the hope that is set before us. So the two unchangeable things are the promise and the oath. Those are the two unchangeable things because God cannot lie. So the oath being analogous to a covenant. Okay. So in verse 19, we have this hope as an anchor for the soul, both sure and steadfast and extending into the inner part of the veil, where as a forerunner, Jesus entered on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So the two unchangeable things referred to in verse 18, so that by two unchangeable things are the promise and the oath, the covenant oath. All right, so now we're going to go to Genesis chapter 12, and we're going to get into some of the promises. Now in Genesis chapter 12, Abram and his family are still in Haran. And this is after Terah, the father, had passed away. Okay. And we're going to read through this section, and then we'll kind of go through it verse by verse here. So in verse 1, it says, Now Yahweh said to Abram, Get out of your country and from your relatives and from your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse the one who curses you. And all the clans of the earth will be blessed in you. So Abram went, as Yahweh had told him to. Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. Abram took Sarai, his wife, Lot, his brother's son, all of their possessions that they had accumulated, and the souls whom they had acquired in Haran. And they went to go into the land of Canaan. When they came into the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of the Moreh, and the Canaanite was already in the land. Again, remember that Moses is writing this 400 years later when they already are getting ready to battle the Canaanites and all that. So even 400 years earlier, the Canaanite people were already inhabiting that area. Yahweh appeared to Abram and he said, I will give this land to your seed. So he built an altar there to Yahweh, who appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to Yahweh and called on the name of Yahweh. Abram traveled, going on still toward Negev. All right, so let's unpack this a little bit. And we're going to go to back to verse 1. And I'm going to read it again. Get out of your country and from your relatives and from your father's house and go to the land that I will show you. So another version, like the NIV, translates it this way. You are to leave your land, as another word for country. Leave your land, your relatives, and your father's house, and go to the land that I'm going to show you. So when we look in Genesis, go back a chapter to Genesis chapter 10, verse 5. So this is the table of nations. In verse 5 it says, of these were the islands of the nations divided in their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their clans in their nations. So the point that I'm making on this is that the nations were divided by their lands. And so when you're thinking of your ancestry, who you were, it was based upon land, not just people. Okay, so Abram in verse 1 is leaving his ancestry. He is asked to leave his ancestry. Back in Genesis 12, yeah. He's asked to leave his ancestry, which was his basis of national identity. So it was a big thing that God was asking him to do, to move all of his stuff and all of his people out of that territory and move down to Canaan. And Abraham was very wealthy, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. So he had lots of cattle and sheep and people and things that he was responsible for. And so to move everybody into this strange territory where there's risk to your life and all that stuff was really asking him a lot. And the promises that are in verses 2 and 3 in chapter 12, are contingent on him leaving. So it was an obligation that Abraham had to do. And then once that obligation was out of the way, the promises don't have any, they're just free from God. They don't have any obligation associated with them. That's what God's going to do for Abram. Okay? So then, so go back to Genesis chapter 12, and in verse 2 is when the promises are being made from God. And the verses 2 and verses 3 have what I call I will statements, 4 I will statements interrupted. So there's 2 I will statements interrupted by a blessing statement, 2 I will statements followed by a blessing statement. So the first promise in verse 2, I will make of you a great nation. And then following that, so I will add one thing there that in this verse, he says, I will make you a great nation. But then later on in chapter 17 in Genesis, he says, I will make you a crowd of nations. So the covenant language and things changes and evolves into more detail as time goes by, and we'll see that. And then the next he says, I will bless you and make your name great. And as a result of that, a result of blessing him and making his name great, he says, you will be a blessing. So 2 of the promises, I will make you a great nation, and then I will bless you and make your name great. And then as a result, you will be a blessing. Those are promises of God. So this one promise, I will bless you and make your name great, really are 2 promises, because those are two different things. So when it says that God will bless him, it's God's going to show personal favor to him. Personal favor is going to be manifested by prosperity, fertility, and is ultimately going to be making his name great. Now, in understanding that making his name great, the distinction here is that prior to Abram, men were trying to make their own name great through work and through effort. Whereas God is telling Abram, I will make your name great. I will give you a reputation. People will know who you are. You will have fame. Let me have you turn back to Genesis chapter 6. We'll point this out a little bit. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also after this, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, the famous men. So, and we've learned that those people weren't particularly nice, and that they were, after having a great name themselves. And then the story about the Tower of Babel makes the same thing in chapter 11, verse 4. Chapter 11, verse 4. They said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top reaches to the heavens, and let's make ourselves a name, lest we be scattered abroad on the surface of the whole earth." So they were striving to make themselves a name through building the Tower of Babel, making themselves famous, making their own reputation great. So what men were striving for up until that point, God will give to Abram, such as a great reputation, exalted status, authority, and all that. And indeed, that happened. So Abraham is known as the father of 3 religions, and people know him all over the world today. So Abram will be a great nation. So this is the promises from verse 2 there. Abram will be a great nation. He'll be personally blessed. He'll receive a great name. And because of that, he'll be a blessing to other people. Who will he be a blessing to? We're going to go on to verse 3. And God says, I will bless or show favor to those who bless you. So people who show favor to you, I will show favor to them. And then continuing on, I will curse the one who curses you. So those who slight Abram, those who persecute him, God will curse them. And as a result, all of the clans of the earth will be blessed in you. So these are 3 more promises. God is going to bless those who bless Abraham, curse those who curse him, and as a result of that, all the clans of the earth will be blessed in Abram. So these are 3 more promises. And then just as an aside here, the commentary that John makes about these, a clan, he says, the term generally refers to a group larger than a family. So a family is father, mother, and children, but smaller than a tribe. So it's that in-between thing. And the point is that the blessing of the Messiah will be available for every family group and every clan. And all the clans and nations listed in Noah, back in the table of nations, will be blessed. So, and understand the difference between the clans and the nations versus every individual. Every individual will not be blessed, but the clans and the nations will be blessed. And then in the phrase, will be blessed in you, John says, this is a promise from God to Abram that the Messiah would be one of his descendants. So this is the first time that the Bible tells us that God told Abraham that the Messiah would come through him. But God repeated that to Abram at various times and ways. It seems unlikely that Abram would forget God telling him that the Messiah would be one of his descendants. But God no doubt told him that a number of times to bless him. And because of the magnitude of the promise, also since it's repeated in the Bible, we are not likely to miss it either. So, after those promises in verses 2 and 3, Abram went. And in verse 4, it says, so Abraham went as Yahweh had told him to do. Told him to. So he's still up in Haran when all this that we just read took place. So Abram went as Yahweh had told him to do. Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. Abram took Sarai, his wife, Lot, his brother's son, all their possessions that they had accumulated, and the souls whom they had acquired in Haran, and they went to go into the land of Canaan. When they came into the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh, and the Canaanite was already in the land. And then God gave another promise in verse 7. So chapter 12, verse 7, Yahweh appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your seed. So he built an altar there. So this is the first promise after he actually was in Canaan. I will give this land to your seed. So he built an altar there to Yahweh, who appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to Yahweh and called on the name of Yahweh. And then Abram traveled, going on toward the Negev. So after that, there was a famine. I'm not going to have you go there, but in Genesis 12:10, there was a famine in the land. Abram went down into Egypt to live as a foreigner there, for the famine was severe in the land of Canaan. So then go to chapter 13. And this is the section about Abram and Lot separate, and the promises are reaffirmed. So in verse 1, Abram went out of Egypt, he, his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him into the Negev. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. So this is important to remember, that Abram was rich, and probably Terah, his father, was even richer, because a lot of that wealth came from inheritance and stuff. And so how rich was that? How rich was Abram? So in Job, you don't need to go there, but in Job chapter 1, verse 3, this is the very introduction of who Job was. So Job was the richest guy in that time frame. And it says in verse 3, Job chapter 1, his possessions also were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very great household, so that this man was the greatest of all the children of the East. So Abram wasn't as rich as Job, but he was very rich. So it just, if you could comprehend, when you're talking about 7,000 sheep, 3,000, that's really huge. And ultimately, when the story where Abram pursues the kings who had captured Lot, he sent over 300 men who were soldiers and defeated armies. So there was a lot of people when Abram was moving around and doing the things that he was doing. A lot of people, a lot of animals is a big deal. Okay, so then back to Genesis chapter 13. It says that in verse 3, he went on his journeys from Negev even to Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar that he had made there at the first. Abram called on the name of Yahweh there. Verse 5, Lot also, who went with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents, because his father had died. His father Haran had died, so he inherited a bunch. Lot also went with Abram. In verse 6, the land was not able to bear them when they lived together. Too much stuff. For their possessions were so great that they could not live together. And there were quarrels between the herdsmen of Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And the Canaanite and the Perizzite lived in the land at that time. So I'm sure they were causing some trouble. So then in verse 10, we'll skip down to verse 10. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the plain of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, like the garden of Yahweh, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. This was before Yahweh destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So verse 11, so Lot chose the plain of the Jordan for himself, and Lot traveled east. So they separated themselves from each other. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, and Lot lived in the cities of the plain and moved his tent near Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinners against Yahweh. And that's how that led to the problems where when the kings of the area attacked the king of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot got swept up in that. So then in verse 14, so this is after the separation, and Abram is left behind after Lot leaves. Verse 14, Yahweh says to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your seed forever. So that's another promise. Verse 16, I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then your seed may also be numbered. That's another promise. Arise, walk through the land, through its length and its breadth, for I will give it to you. So this is where God is making this firm promise about the land of Canaan will ultimately belong to Abram's seed, even though Abram himself will not possess it. So in verse 18, Abram moved his tent and went and lived by the oaks of Mamre that are in Hebron, and built an altar to Yahweh there. So then in chapter 14, this is just to kind of help build some context about when all this is going on. We'll just briefly cover the rescue of Lot. In Genesis 14, verse 11, so when the kings from the north had come down and attacking Sodom and Gomorrah, they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food and went their way. That was in verse 11. Verse 12, they also took Lot, son of Abram's brother, who lived in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. So we read earlier, that's a lot that Lot had. A lot for Lot. So all those sheep, all those cattle, all those people, all of that belonged to Lot were all taken by these kings. Then in verse 14, when Abram heard that his relative was taken captive, he led out his trained slaves, born in his house, 318, and pursued as far as Dan. He divided himself against them by night, he and his servants, and struck them and pursued them to Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. He brought back all the goods, and also brought back his relative Lot and his goods, and the women also, and the other people. And after that was when he gave a tenth of that to Melchizedek. And at this point, we're ready to get into the Abrahamic covenant and all the details that go with that. And so we'll pick up on that next time either next week or sometime after that. So just as a reminder, so the promises that we've heard thus far, where God says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse the ones who curse you. All the clans of the earth will be blessed in you. I will give you this land to your seed. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your seed forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if a man can number the dust of the earth, then your seed may also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land, through its length and its breadth, for I will give it to you. Any questions?
I thought that was pretty cool, Doug. Yesterday I was listening to the recorded teachings from like a year ago on Galatians, and that they spent a bunch of time on the Abrahamic covenant, because the whole context there was that there were Jews that became Christians but were zealous for the law, and they were wanting the Gentile Christians to act like Jews, and that it was quite a big thing, and Paul had to really confront them and say, when, for example, that when God made his promise with Abraham, it was before he was circumcised, and that it's not a requirement to be circumcised to be part of that covenant, of Abraham's covenant, and that sort of thing. So it was cool that you picked it up, that you included that some of Galatians in there, because Galatians chapter 3 becomes much richer when you have this covenant understanding from Genesis.
I think ultimately when we get to the new covenant, we'll be able to incorporate, because of this foundation, we'll be able to incorporate this information into understanding the new covenant much better. And you can see from today's examples, circumcision has not been a part of this at all so far.
Right.
So next time, though, when we get into the Abrahamic covenant, then we're going to see where circumcision comes in. But it doesn't come in right with the Abrahamic covenant is made. It comes in later. So, yeah.
Christian, Jewish, and Muslim?
Yeah.
One thing Paul says in Galatians, when he's, talking to these Jewish Christians, is he says, he's kind of quoting the Old Testament and the record in Genesis, and he said, and he gave it to a seed, not seeds, and that the seed is Jesus Christ, that he pointed that out. And that, but looking at Acts 7:5, that kind of threw me, because Stephen says, but he gave him no inheritance in it, not so much to set his foot on, but he promised that he would give it to him as a possession and to his seed after him, even though he had no child. And God spoke this way, that his seed should be foreigners in a strange land, and that they would enslave them and mistreat them 400 years. And I think if the seed that they were talking about is Jesus Christ, well, he wasn't enslaved on this earth 400 years, because they crucified him, when he was barely 30-ish, a smidge over. And, at that point, it suggests, that seed is a bigger thing than just the one when Stephen talks in Acts. And so it just kind of throws me a little bit, that Paul looks to the seed as the one seed, being Jesus Christ.
I have a little bit to share on that next week.
Really?
Yeah. And one of the things about that is the English word seed can be single or plural.
Right.
Right. So there's something lost in trying to, like when you read these verses that you were talking about, understanding the difference between the seed, who is Jesus, and the seed of Abraham, who are his offspring. And so it's not just word for word. You have to understand the context and understand you have to go back and understand the promises, exactly what the language was for that. So it is, and it's not crystal clear. Like when you're reading those, what's he talking about? He's talking about the people, or he's talking about Jesus? And so you have to do a little investigation to understand that. And so I have a little section to talk about that next time.
Excellent.
Because it's controversial. Some of it's controversial. The part that Paul says is not controversial, because he said, this is what it means,
Yeah.
But some of that's from Revelation and all that, for God told him that's exactly what it means. But even back when they're translating the Hebrew, the scholars say, well, this example, the seed is definitely many. But this example, it could be many or it could be singular. Because, as many things in the Bible, it can represent the people, or it can represent Jesus, and it makes sense both ways.
Right.
Which I think that's kind of amazing about Scripture sometimes. It has double meanings.
I love that. And you pointed out that Abraham was the father of 3 nations, and I get that. But the part that throws me is that, the Muslims, they can claim Abraham as their father, but they don't really talk about the Messiah much.
No. But he's
And
in the Quran.
like,
Messiah. Jesus is in the Quran as a
Jesus
prophet.
is in the Quran as a prophet, but they don't really seem to understand the concept of a Messiah, Genesis 3:15 type Messiah. Like there's going to be someone that comes and, you know, corrects all this stuff. They don't seem to get that.
Right.
And it's strange that as descendants of Abraham, you'd think they would.
Right. But I don't understand Islam as much. They have that, what, the 13th Imam or whatever that is or something. They have some kind of future somebody that they're looking forward to.
Ah, do they? Okay.
So, but that's, I don't have any knowledge about that.
Yeah, I haven't really dug into it that much. I just get little droplets, you know, splashes of it here and there. Like I've talked to like a Muslim taxi driver. I've talked to a Muslim on a plane once. I've talked to Janet, who's done some, you know, a little bit more reading and studying on Muslims, at least current day experiences, as far as they're converting over to Christianity and stuff. So, yeah. Very little.
Any other comments from anybody or questions or anything?
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. It's fun to go through this. I get a lot out of it.
So I guess we stop the recording then?
Yeah, that's okay.